Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Kristen, and here we explore an experiential approach to spiritual awakening and conscious manifestation, or as I like to call it, the law of reflection. So, firstly, let's look at the difference between ego and self, as this is a question that I do get quite a lot. And when I use the term self and ego, I am really using them interchangeably. They both mean the same thing. The reason that I don't use the term ego as much as the term self is because it's very easy to create a distinction between the self and the ego. So we often think of the self as the person that we are with all of these different stories, beliefs, opinions, preferences, the character, right? But when it comes to ego, we often think of ego as the parts of ourself that perhaps we don't like, or the parts of ourselves that we often try to resist and push down. So, for example, we might say that wanting to be financially abundant, wanting to be wealthy, is a desire coming from the self. But then we may say that any negative thoughts about wealth, any perceived limitations or insecurities around the area of wealth are the ego. And we would label this as ego because we see it as something negative, or we see it as something unwanted or an obstacle that is in the way. But really, the desire for financial abundance is just as much the ego as the limitations that often come up. There really is no difference between the self and the ego. It is really very much the same thing. So it's not that the ego is just reserved for the parts of ourself that we know is coming from a disempowered position. So, with that being said, what actually is the self? So, the self is never a static entity, even though we often perceive it to be that way. For example, the story that we tell about who we are often remains largely unchanged for most of our lifetime. There may be elements of it that grow and expand or even contract, but for the most part, we tend to have a solid idea of who we are. So, for example, I am Kristen, I'm a British woman. I have a dog and a cat. I'm a spiritual teacher. All of these different things are all elements of a story of self that appears to be relatively fixed. But really, the self is more like a mosaic of different parts. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. Now, these different elements or expressions or parts of self, they tend to fall into three main categories. That is the authentic self, the negotiated self, or the idealized self. So let's look at the negotiated self first, as this is the one that we are usually heavily identified with, especially in adulthood. And so the negotiated self is the self that we become in response to our surroundings, our environment, the society that we were raised in, the family that we were raised in, the events that happened to us during childhood, and what we made those experiences mean about ourselves. So, an example of a negotiated expression of self could be if in childhood we felt abandoned and then we made that a story of self, we made that mean something about who we are, the negotiated self we become is a response to that abandonment. It is a self that we have constructed in order to hopefully avoid the same experiences of abandonment. Now, as we know, as conscious manifestors, what we resist persists, what we avoid continues to be reflected back to us through the divine mirror of the manifested reality. So, this negotiated self, it doesn't actually work. It's more of a protection mechanism. So, as a negotiated self, we may become more insecure when it comes to connections with other people. We may behave a certain way in order to avoid being rejected or abandoned or betrayed. We may develop trust issues because we expect the same things to happen over again because they have so far. We may we may become avoidant, we may become self sabotaging. And all of these different elements are aspects of self that we have developed as a way to avoid or cope with circumstances that we don't want to experience, circumstances that are painful. Now, for the majority of adults, the negotiated self will make up the majority of what you embody on a day to day basis. Most of the time, we are living in survival mode. We're living in this defensive, self protective mechanism to avoid experiences that we believe cause us pain because we believe that they mean something about who we truly are, even though they don't. The negotiated self may also be thought of as the self that we think we need to heal or fix or improve in some way. It's an element of self that we have not really truly loved and accepted. Now, before we developed a negotiated self, we were actually embodying more of the authentic self. Now, most young children, before any trauma occurs, before we create this negotiated self in response to our experience, most children are in their authentic self. And this is what in some religions is described as having that childlike nature. The childlike nature comes with the authentic self. The authentic self feels less limited. It does not have a grand story of all these perceived limitations. It's a more curious self, it's an expressive self, it's a creative self. When we are in the embodiment of the authentic self, this is the self where we tend to be at our most joyful, at our most free, our most creative, our most loving, because this is the self that you would be if you had no other stories, no other limitations about who you believe you are. Now, the third category is the idealized self. And this often gets mistaken with the authentic self, but actually it isn't. The idealized self is more of a future projection. It's not something that you are necessarily embodying right now, but it's more the self that you wish you were, or the self you think you need to be in order to be happy. So we might think of this as your best self, your biggest, best, brightest version of self that has already achieved everything you want to achieve, that has everything that you will already desire. This idealized self is the one that often drives us. We want to become that idealized self. We feel unhappy when we are not that self. We want to fix the negotiated self in order to become the idealized version. Now, I'm not saying there is necessarily anything wrong with the idealized version, but that it is not actually the same as the authentic self. And many people reach the idealized expression of self and they're still not happy. A really good example of that could be celebrities, people that are famous or well known, that have a lot of money. They are physically beautiful. They have everything they could possibly want, career, material objects, but still, they do not feel happy. They do not feel content in their life because who they have become is a mixture of a negotiated self and an idealized version of self that they only feel accepted when they are that. They feel accepted by others when they're the idealized self, and they only feel accepted by themselves when they are the idealized self. Now, if someone was to step more into the authentic expression of self rather than the idealized expression of self, they may find that some of the things they desired as the idealized expression falls away. They realized that they didn't really want that anyway. What they were seeking was something much deeper. What they were really seeking was love, connection, feeling good in themselves, feeling peaceful, enjoying their day to day life, living on their own terms. And these are not expressions of the idealized self, they're expressions of the authentic self. Now, the reason that I mention this is because when it comes to conscious manifestation, and if you are familiar with the manifestation community as it currently stands, which, if you're watching this video, you probably are, most of the dialogue in that community encourages us to go after the idealized self. It enables us to believe that it is the idealized self that will truly make us happy, when really happiness is part of our true essence as divinity. So when you are less concerned with being the idealized self and you are more focused on understanding yourself as the divine, you will find that you are not looking to experiences or the objects of experience in order to make you happy. You will realize that happiness and contentment actually is not found there. Happiness and contentment is your true expression as the divine. So when we realize our divine nature, we automatically realize our nature as happiness, love, and oneness. And this is why I teach understanding yourself as divinity first, rather than chasing desires, rather than chasing experiences or the objects of experience. I recommend to actually come back to your true essence as divinity or God or consciousness, whichever word resonates with you the most. Because when you do so, the authentic expression of self unfolds on its own. Now, what do I mean by that? It unfolds on its own in the sense that you are not trying to make something happen. You are not chasing any particular experience or desire, but instead you are dwelling in your true nature, and therefore the mirror of the physical world, or what appears to be a physical world, begins to reflect this state of embodiment back to you, which would then lead to manifesting the life that you actually want. But the authentic expression of self would start to unfold without you having to try to do anything to become it. You would just find yourself becoming different, becoming authentic to who you truly are. And yes, your desires might change. And some people don't like it when I say that. And of course, I understand why. It's because there's a high degree of attachment to a particular desire. But this does not mean that you cannot experience what you wish to experience. But it is true that the more we express as the authentic self, there is a chance that what you thought you wanted might change. This is not the case for every single desire, but if the desire is coming more from an idealized version of self, a self you think you should be, a self that you think is going to make you happy, there is always the chance that certain desires will dissolve or fade away. And what you might find is that you may start having different desires, desires perhaps you didn't think of before. Or it could be desires that feel more like the childlike self that you were as a child before we develop this negotiated self, before we develop this mask in order to avoid the things that we don't want to experience, in order to protect ourselves. And this is another reason why I don't focus on becoming an idealized self and trying to manifest what you think the idealized self wants. Instead, focusing on yourself as consciousness, understanding your true nature, dwelling in that, and then allowing yourself to go with that flow. We could call it a divine flow. It will move you effortlessly in the direction that you truly, truly desire. And this will not be a mistake. There is no loss in allowing yourself to express as the authentic self. Now, you may ask me, why is she talking about self? Why is she talking about expressing as an authentic self when everything else she's teaching is that we are not just the self, that we are the divine? And this is a great question because there is always going to be an element of self at play. So, understanding yourself as divinity, it is not spiritual elitism. It is not claiming yourself as God of the reality and you're not a real human and you're supernatural and you're controlling everything. This is the ego playing the role of God. So, God or divinity, it is not a costume that we put on, it is not a role that the self plays. It's also not a state that we get into, by the way, and I could make an entirely separate video on this, but God is not a state. You cannot get into a God state. The God state does not exist. God is not a state. God is the truth of who you really are, expressing through form. And you, as God, you, as divinity, want to express through your authentic self. So, the authentic self is a marriage between yourself as divinity and the expression of that divinity, which is the authentic self. So, the more that we understand ourselves in a more expansive way, that we are one with everything, that we are everything, even though at the moment it appears that we are looking through an individual lens, through a limited standpoint, we are actually all that exists. We are the divine itself. And the form that it is currently expressing through is yours to choose. We experience our desires quicker, more effortlessly, and more authentically when we are coming from the standpoint of the marriage between ourselves as divinity and the expression of the authentic self. And yes, this will change how you go about manifestation. It may also change your trajectory and what it is you actually want to experience. But as I said before, there is no loss in this, there is no struggle in this. That this approach is more about going with divine flow, understanding the truth of who you are, and allowing yourself to receive and experience whatever it is you wish to experience that is not coming from a negotiated self or an idealized self. I hope this helps.